Number 3. James Adamski. On the night before Halloween 1982, 18-year-old James Adamski of Cheektowaga, New York, went to a Halloween party at a bar that was about 4 miles from his home. At the time, the legal drinking age in New York was 18. The promotion for the party was to pay one price, and then it was all you could drink. Friends and former girlfriends saw James at the bar. He was dressed in a costume that he called American Gigolo. People noticed that he was quite drunk. At some point in the night, James and some other partygoers got into an argument. The argument was settled before things got physical. James closed out the bar and he was last seen walking towards his home. When his parents woke up on Halloween morning, they found his bed empty and they became worried. James never stayed out all night without telling them first. They contacted the police, and then they, along with the local fire department, searched for James for months, but by Christmas, no trace of him had been found. Then the day after Christmas, 2 men hunting rabbits called the police because they found human remains in a shallow grave. The police arrived on the scene, and they were able to identify the body as James Adamski. He was still wearing his American Gigolo costume. An autopsy was performed, and based on several markings on his forehead, the medical examiner concluded that someone, or several people, hit him multiple times in the head with a blunt object. What that blunt object was is unknown. The medical examiner speculated that it was possibly a baseball bat, a 2x4, or a tire iron. The police think that early on Halloween, James was walking home drunk and someone picked him up in their vehicle. They aren't sure if he was hitchhiking or if he was picked up by someone he knew. Another possibility is that the driver, or other people in the vehicle, forced James to get into the vehicle. They also aren't sure if the person, or persons, who picked him up did so with the intention of hurting him, or if they got into an argument after James was in the vehicle. Nevertheless, after beating him to death, the killer, or killers, drove him about 5 miles away from where he was last seen and buried him in the shallow grave. Over the years, the police have exhausted all their leads. They interviewed everyone who was at the bar that night, including the people who James got into an argument with, but they, like every other suspect, had a solid alibi. James's younger brother Andy said that the murder was tough on his family. He said that his mother wasn't the same afterwards. She was always terrified that the person who killed James would kill him too. Both of his parents passed away in the 2000s without ever finding out who killed James. The police say that the murder of James Adamski will most likely only be solved if someone who knows something about the murder comes forward. If someone doesn't come forward, his surviving family members may have to live out the rest of their lives without ever knowing who stole James from them. Number 2. Ernestine Andregg. In the autumn of 1995, 50-year-old Ernestine Andregg was living with her son and her boyfriend in Rogers, Arkansas. On Halloween night, Andregg was home alone handing out candy. While she was handing out candy, her daughter and her granddaughter stopped by the house. They didn't stay long, and they left Andregg home alone to hand out candy. Later that evening, Andregg's boyfriend arrived home and found the front door ajar. He went into the kitchen and found Andregg dead on the floor. She had been stabbed to death. The police came to the house and found no signs of a break-in. Nothing was stolen from the house, so they don't think that robbery was a motive. The police have several theories about what happened that night. The first is that she was killed by someone she knew, and she let them into the house. The second is that she was killed by a stranger. Since it was Halloween, Andregg would have opened the door to anyone who rang the doorbell. It's quite possible that the killer was wearing a mask or some type of costume. If a person in a mask rang her doorbell on any other day, Andregg would have locked the door and called the police. But since it was Halloween, she probably just opened the door to her killer. The police aren't sure if Andregg was specifically targeted or if the murder was just a random act of violence. The police never found the murder weapon, and they don't think it came from the family's home. That means the killer was most likely carrying the knife with them, suggesting the murder was premeditated. It's also possible that the killer was looking for anyone to attack. They just happened to be walking down Andregg Street, saw her handing out candy, realized that she was alone, and they attacked her as a crime of opportunity. Complicating matters further is the fact that there was a traveling carnival set up near Andregg's house. The police think it is highly possible that a person working at the carnival committed the crime. He or she stabbed Andregg to death and simply left town with the carnival a few days later. Unfortunately, the police have no suspects and they have no idea who stabbed to death Ernestine Andregg, the 50-year-old grandmother, as she was handing out candy on Halloween night, 1995. Number 1. Shannon Olson. On the afternoon of Halloween 1987, the police were called to an industrial park in Wichita, Kansas. The body of a young woman, probably in her teens, had been found in a pond. The police pulled the partially dressed body from the pond. Her hands had been bound behind her back with her bra. They looked around for the rest of her clothes, but they weren't there. She also didn't have any identification on her. It was obvious she had been stabbed many times. The medical examiner confirmed that was the cause of death during the autopsy. Her throat had been slit and she had been stabbed dozens of times in the neck and the head in a frenzied attack. One thing that the medical examiner noted that would hopefully help identify the young woman was that she had a 5-star pentagram tattoo on one of her ankles. A description of the young woman and her tattoo was made public, and several days after she was found, a man named John Earl identified the young woman as his stepdaughter, 15-year-old Shannon Olson. Shannon had last been seen around 11 o'clock the night before her body was found. She left her friend's home to go find some alcohol. The medical examiner said that she died sometime in the early morning hours of Halloween. Earl said that Shannon was out of control. She barely went to school, and most of the time she crashed at friends' houses instead of coming home. Her friends agreed with Earl and thought that Shannon partied too much. They also said that she had become fascinated with the occult. Supposedly, she had been hanging out with a group of devil worshippers. She got her pentagram tattoo with the rest of the group. Earl denied that Shannon was involved in any satanic activity. He said that the only way her murder could be connected to the occult is if she was kidnapped by a group of Satanists. Besides the devil worshippers, there are 2 other infamous people who are considered a suspect by some. Some people suggest that the Zodiac, who killed 5 people in Northern California during the 1960s, is responsible, although that seems unlikely. The theory stems from a letter the Vallejo Times-Herald received 3 days before the murder of Shannon Olson. The writer claimed to be the Zodiac, and he said that on Halloween he planned to run down a kid with his car. The problem with the theory is that the letter is most likely fake. It had been over a decade since the last letter from the Zodiac. Another problem is that Shannon was stabbed and not run down with a car. Also, Wichita, Kansas is over 1,500 miles away from the area of California where the Zodiac murders happened. Finally, experts don't think that the handwriting matches earlier letters. Another suspect is Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK killer. Rader's first confirmed murders happened on the morning of January 15, 1974, in Wichita, Kansas. 9-year-old Joseph Otero Jr. opened the door to let the dog out. When he did, Radar forced his way in. Besides Joseph Jr., inside the house was his mother, 34-year-old Julie Otero, who was a former co-worker of Radar's, her husband, 34-year-old Joseph Sr., and their 11-year-old daughter, Josephine. He led all 4 family members to a bedroom at gunpoint and then tied them up. He ended up strangling Joseph Sr., Julie, and Joseph Jr. in the bedroom with a piece of cord cut from a Venetian blind that he brought with him. He then took Josephine to the basement and hung her from a pipe. Radar pleasured himself while she died. 15-year-old Charlie Otero discovered his family dead after returning home from school. 10 months after the murders, Radar phoned a columnist at the newspaper, the Wichita Eagle. Radar told him to go to the public library and look in a book called Applied Engineering Mechanics. The columnist did, and he found a letter claiming responsibility for the Otero murders. The letter contained information that only the killer would know. In the postscript of the letter, Radar gave his code name: Bind, Torture, Kill, or simply known as the acronym BTK. On April 4th, Radar broke into the home of another former co-worker, 21-year-old Catherine Bright, while she wasn't at home. He waited for her to return, and he was surprised when her brother, Kevin Bright, walked in the door with her. Radar forced Kevin to tie up his sister in one of the bedrooms, and then he led Kevin to another bedroom where he tied him to a bed. First he tried to strangle Kevin, but he fought too much. He broke free from his bindings, and Radar shot him in the head. He then went to the other bedroom and started to strangle Catherine. As Radar was strangling her, he heard something in the other room and realized that Kevin wasn't dead. They fought again, and Kevin managed to steal Radar's second gun, a Magnum. Radar jammed his finger behind the trigger so Kevin couldn't fire. Radar then shot Kevin again. Thinking he was finally dead, Radar went and stabbed Catherine 11 times. After the attack, he ran to his car and drove off. Kevin survived the attack, but Catherine did not. Nearly 3 years later, Radar's need to kill resurfaced. He went to a home that he had been scoping out, but his potential victim wasn't home. Instead, he started walking around the neighborhood, and he saw a little boy. After knocking on a random door and finding no one home, Radar went to the boy's home and knocked on the door. The boy's mother, 24-year-old Shirley Vian, answered the door. Radar said that he was a private detective looking for a lost boy, so she let him into the house. Once inside, Radar pulled out a gun and forced Vian and 3 of her children into a bedroom. Eventually, Radar and Vian moved into the washroom, where Radar strangled her to death. As she was dying, the phone rang, and one of the children answered it. They told the caller that a strange man was in the washroom with their mother. So Radar fled the crime scene, leaving the children alive. Later that same year, on December 9th, he broke into the home of 25-year-old Nancy Fox while she was at work, and he waited for her to get home. Radar had been stalking Fox for some time. Radar called potential victims he stalked projects. He ended up handcuffing and then strangling Fox to death with his belt. Nearly 6.5 years later, Radar struck again. On April 27, 1985, he broke into the home of Maureen Hedge, who lived a few doors down from Radar in Park City. She was the only victim of Radar who did not live in Wichita. He strangled her and put her body in the car. He then drove to the church where he was a deacon. He tied her body up in a variety of ways and took Polaroid pictures of her. He then dumped her body off of a side road and covered it with some brush. Her body was found just over a week later. Nearly a year and a half later, on the 16th of September 1986, Radar broke into the home of Vicki Wegerle and strangled her to death. Her husband found her body in their house later that night. 13 months after that murder, Shannon Olson was stabbed to death. The police received several anonymous letters accusing the BTK killer of murdering her. But Radar himself never wrote a letter claiming responsibility for the murder. On the other hand, he didn't distance himself from the murder either. 2 months after Olson was killed, 3 members of the Fager family were killed in their home in Wichita. Mary Fager returned from a trip out of town, and she found her husband and her 2 daughters murdered. Her husband had been shot, 1 daughter had been strangled, and the other was drowned in the hot tub. The prime suspect in the triple murder is a contractor who worked on the home named William Butterworth. He was found driving the Fagers' cars several days after the murders in Florida. He admitted to being at the house at the time of the murders, but claimed he walked in on a man killing the family. He became afraid and he fled in their car. He was ultimately acquitted when he was taken to trial, but the police still think he is the real killer. After the murders, Radar wrote a letter to Mary saying he didn't kill her family, but he was a fan of the killer. In January 1990, 3.5 years after his last confirmed kill, Radar broke into the home of 62-year-old Dolores Davis. He strangled her to death with her pantyhose. He put her in the trunk of her car and then dumped her body under a bridge. Radar then went on a hiatus from killing, but continued to send letters or hide them around Wichita. In February 2005, a local TV station in Wichita got a computer disk from the BTK killer. The police traced the disk to the church, where Radar was the president of the Congressional Council, and he was arrested. During his killing spree, Radar stayed married to the same woman, and his wife gave birth to a son and a daughter. He worked for AD&T Security and then became a city inspector. Besides being an involved member of his church, he was also a Boy Scout leader. After he was arrested, in explicit detail, he confessed to the 10 murders. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences. During his confession, he did not admit to killing Shannon Olson. Radar kept souvenirs and photographs of his victims, and the police found no evidence tying him to Shannon's murder. Shannon's murder also doesn't exactly fit into Radar's pattern. Specifically, Radar broke in or forced his way into the homes of all his victims. Shannon was kidnapped while she was out running an errand. But there are also some similarities. Shannon was bound and stripped like many of Radar's victims. While Radar strangled most of his victims, he did stab Catherine Bright to death. Shannon's body was also found dumped in nature, just like Maureen Hedges and Dolores Davis. Radar is serving his sentence in the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. However, there is no evidence that Dennis Radar was responsible for the gruesome murder of Shannon Olson, and her killer may still be out, wandering the streets. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please subscribe. We post a new video every Thursday and Sunday. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. The links are in the description below the video. But that's all for now. Thanks again for watching.